I think I'm on. There we go. Good morning. How are you doing? I was out at the pastors' conference this last week. So I got back on Tuesday. So if I fall asleep during my sermon, please excuse me. I took the red eye on Thursday night back from Denver, and got in around. Yeah, she's already yawning. See, you too, man. I'll tell you, everybody. It's a busy week, but came back. I was flying back, and I met a guy. It seems like it's really high. I met a guy on the airplane. Well, actually, before at the USO, before we came, and was talking to him. Said he was a Unitarian Universalist. So we had some conversation, and then found out he was come here to Yardley. So we gave him a ride to his brother's house when we got here back in at like 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning. But I was talking to him in the place we got talking. He says he's a stand-up comedian, and so we were talking about jokes, and so forth. So I told him a couple that I knew, that I thought were really interesting. One, I told him about the Adam and Eve. I said oftentimes, and he knew the Bible pretty much. I seem to know pretty well. And I said, I said, the problem with the Adam and Eve was that, and he was talking about the apple and everything else. I said, the problem with Adam and Eve, it wasn't the apple on the tree, it was the pear on the ground. Yeah, well, see, he didn't get it. He didn't get it. And I said, the pear on the ground. He said, the pear, apple. I know the apple. I know pear. I said, yeah, pear. He says, oh, P-A-I-O. Oh. So if you know that I don't tell too many jokes in church, when a comedian can't even get your joke, you're in bad shape, okay? So I tell them, it seems like I have to explain myself sometimes when I'm going through jokes, but anyway, that's why. So if you understand that, you don't get a whole lot of jokes here because you don't laugh. If you laughed at my jokes, I would say, tell more. But anyway, we're in Esther chapter 4, verses 15 through 17 today, and as we go through that, we're going to find some what seems like coincidences. Stuff that just seems different. But we know that coincidences with us are not coincidences, are they? They're acts of God. And oftentimes they're a result of prayer. And we're going to be starting in Esther chapter 5 today. We're going to do 3 chapters, chapters 5, 6, and 7. And when we start out Esther 5, we really need to start a couple verses before. And take your Bibles with me, and you'll turn to Esther. We're not going to stand and read the Word of God this morning because we're going through 3 chapters, and I really couldn't find one section that I wanted to read this morning because I want to go through the whole thing with us, the 5 through 7. Not that they'll read every verse there, but so we're going to forgo that. But I do want to read with you as we start chapter 5. I want to read the last 3 verses of Esther. Now, I listened to your sermon on the tape there on YouTube last week, Pastor Ed, and yes, you did steal some of my thunder, as you said. Got into my chapter a little bit, but we'll excuse you for this week. But it's kind of hard with Esther to kind of not go a little forward or a little bit back. And the last 3 verses of Esther chapter 4 are really important as we enter today's section. So let's just read it for briefly. It says, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai. Now remember the story. Mordecai has told her that Haman wants to kill all the Jews. And so he wants her to walk in to see the king. But if she walks in and sees him and he doesn't hold out the scepter, what happens to her? Okay? So this is really a life and death kind of thing for her. So is she going to do it or not? She says, yeah, I'm going to do it. But she makes this one request of Mordecai in these verses. Starting in verse 16, go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and pray for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my maidens will fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him. And so we find that prayer has bathed her in what she's about to do. She says, I need a lot of prayer. I'm about to lose my life if this doesn't go well. So this is really important. So please pray for me. So for 3 days, I went for prayer and fasting. I don't know how many of you have done fasting. Most of us don't do it anymore, unfortunately. Sometimes we fast for health reasons. I've done that. Like my dad used to fast every Monday. Didn't spend the whole day in prayer necessarily, but he'd fast on Mondays. And I started doing that for a little bit last year. And don't do it often enough now, as you can see. But at any rate, it's not only a health thing, but the idea of them prayer and fasting was that they were going to direct only all their attention at one thing. They weren't going to be worried about what they're eating or anything else. They were going to direct all their attention to prayer. and that would change things. And we're not going to go into a whole section on prayer today, but we could, talking about the benefits, and you'll see how prayer comes in today and in some of these sermons. And it's important to keep good relationship with God. Now we're going to find today that when you look at this, there's a certain circumstance that came in and she asked people to pray. And that happens most people's lives, right? Something happens wrong, you have a big decision to make, maybe you'll pray, but really prayer should take place all the time. It says in Thessalonians, it says, pray without ceasing. That doesn't mean always being on your knees in prayer every day and every second of the day, but it means always be ready to pray, always be in the attitude of prayer. Sometimes it's when you're driving the car, hopefully with your eyes open, but maybe whatever time you have during the day, think of praying to God and bringing things to his attention and considering those things as important. When I was a kid, I liked these books. One of the commentators I read talked about them also. In fact, this is probably my reading level right now, the Hardy Boys. Anybody read the Hardy Boys? A couple, you have the old time. Any young people ever read the Hardy Boys? Do you even know about the Hardy Boys? No. Boy, great literature, really great literature. I loved them as a kid. I mean, this is where I get in trouble, because I'd take it up to bed at night, and I'd put it under my pillow with the light, and I'd be reading, and my mom would come up, and I'd have to close it real hard, and kind of thing. I love the Hardy Boys. And in fact, this is book 1 of the Hardy Boys series. It goes way back. The dates on it is let me see, 1959, when it was written and when it was published. I don't know if these are still out today, but they were fun stories. And the Hardy Boys, they were two sons of a guy, and they always wind up getting in detective kind of situations. So a coincidence would happen. They'd run into a person that was at a certain place or that knew things, and they were solving all kinds of mysteries. This one's the Tower Treasure, and this one's the Secret of the Old Mill. But when you hit coincidences in here, it was kind of like, how did that happen? Today when we look at Esther, and I'm going to, towards the middle of it, I'm going to talk about some of the things that people would say were coincidences. And when we look back, we find they really aren't coincidences. Did you know that Esther is the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention what? God, the name of God. It's not mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther. But as we look through the book of Esther, I'm going to put these over here. Hopefully I'll remember them for second service. But as we look at the book of Esther, we'll find that there seem to be a lot of coincidences coming up that shape these things. And we want to talk about those a little bit as we go through. So if you take your notes out, I have them in your Bible there. You can fill in the different spaces. And the first section I'm going to deal with is verses 1 through 8 of chapter 5. And I call this the strategy of Esther. And if you look at your notes, it says the subtitle, The Invitation and First Banquet, the strategy of Esther. Esther didn't just walk in and say, this is the way it's going to be. She actually strategized what she was going to do. Sometimes we like to say we fly from the hip or whatever, we take on something from a gut feeling. But this was a big thing for her. And she strategized a lot on how she was going to do that. Let's just walk through this a little bit, and we won't read all the verses, but we'll read some of them. It says, now on the third day that Esther put on her robes. Why the third day? Third day after the prayer meeting, for all of them. She put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms, and the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance of the palace. Notice the detail here. I think, when you think of this, she didn't act hastily, did she? She put on a royal robe. She thought about what she's going to go in and say, what she's going to do. Verse 2, and it happened when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight, and the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to Esther, what is troubling you, Queen Esther, and what is your request? Even the half of the kingdom, it will be given to you. Now this offer to Esther, you'll find it comes up 3 times here in this section. I'll give you up to half of the kingdom. What do you want to do? What would you like? Your request. Now she realized that she and the rest of the Jews are about to be killed in this endeavor. But if you walked up and a king who was filthy rich and owned the whole empire and could give you anything, said, I'll give you up to half the kingdom, what would you ask for? Huh? Half the kingdom, yeah, probably would. Yeah, half the kingdom. They say, we don't know if he actually meant that or if it was just a phrase, but that's a big request. I'll give you half of the kingdom or anything underneath it. What would you like? What would you like today? What if I could give you anything in the world? what would you ask for? Ever think through that? She had to make a request. Now, she'd been thinking about this, and she obtained the commander's favor. Now, this is a big deal for her. We read this through and think, oh, she's going to see the king, so what? She's the queen, she walks in, and that happens. This is a big deal. I can only relate it to me, again, going back to my Army experience, okay? And in the Army, the commander is the final word on everything. And the commander can make your life easy, or the commander can make your life miserable. And it depends what goes on. And when you go in to see the commander, if the commander says, I want to see you, you go in there with a little bit of fear and trepidation, As a chaplain, I felt like, for the most part, I had, a fairly good relationship, and they'd want me, and you might be asking, really come in and say, give me advice, but how are the troops doing? That was my job, to find out how the soldiers are doing, give them kind of a morale, kind of a report on them. But I remember one time, back in the beginning of my career, this is my second unit. The commander and the chaplain's kind of always with the commander, and as well as the sergeant major, and be able to give advice and be places where make sure the commander doesn't get in trouble and do something he shouldn't do, maybe morality and all those kind of things, ethics. And so I was they had a big meeting of everybody and said, would all the officers leave? I want to talk just to the NCOs. Well, something was coming down, and it was not good, okay? He was unhappy in some way. And so I stayed in the back of the room, because the chaplain is there, and if anything goes wrong or whatever, he's kind of a protector. And he looked at me and said, Chaplain, please leave. Well, that doesn't look good. I will tell you that I was very, upset, very nervous, I don't quite remember whether I said something right at that point, but it was like he emphasized in front of all the NCOs, Chaplain, basically, get out of here. And I left. Later he talked to me, so I just wanted to talk to them, but I will tell you, that is a nerve-wracking thing when you get called out by a commander. Really bad stuff. And for her to walk in and talk to the king, I don't think she'd say, oh, hey there, hubby, how you doing? She's walking in there with all the protocol. She touches his, he reaches out a scepter, she touches it, and I'm sure she's shaking, when she puts her hand out, because she's about to ask for her life. And what does she do? So she strategizes, I think. She thinks about what she's going to do, and she already has this plan, because she started to already prepare this banquet for the king and for Haman, who's the nemesis in this particular area. And I think we can take this particular example and think of it as we walk before God. When she went before the king, she was trembling. When I went before the commander in some sense, and I can only remember 3 times when I got in trouble with the commander or he didn't like something I did. And I'll tell you, I was as nervous as all get out, because I'm not used to ever being on the hot seat. I try to plan my things, do everything right so that, I'm doing the right thing. And boy, I'll tell you, it really is a big deal when that happens. And I can tell you all 3 incidents, the details of all 3 times that I can remember when things didn't go well with the commander. And she was in that spot. But I'll tell you, when we go to God, we don't have to fear God. God loves us, and it says he wants to do what we want. It says he wants to give us the delights of our heart. Now, if we're not doing what God wants us to do, there might be a little bit of fear and trembling when we go before God. But in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16, he says, let us therefore come boldly into the throne of grace, that we might obtain mercy and may find grace in time of need. We go before God, we don't have to be trembling unless we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. And then we got to say, what's my life like? But for the most part, God is a loving God. And he's a loving God, but he's also a just God. So if we're violating something, we need to worry about that. But other than that, it's not the fear that she had, but she had a great fear here. And we really need to feel that. So he offers up at the half of the kingdom. And some of the questions she asks, well, I've got a banquet, and I want you and Haman to come. Now, why did she ask Haman to come? We don't really know. I mean, what is she going to ask for the banquet? She wants what? Yeah, she wants to save her people. And who's the bad guy? Haman. So why ask the bad guy to the banquet? Why not ask the king to come and leave Haman out of it, get the king to go on your side, and let him go do his work with Haman? I don't know. But she strategized that she wanted him there. And as we'll see as it comes along, it really works out well. And so she seemed to think that this is the best thing to have him come. And I don't know if she planned the way he would feel, but he really put himself in a bad spot. In verse 5 it says, "Then the king said to bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther desires." So she was already prepared. She didn't go in there to ask a request and think, well, let's have a party and see if he comes. Oh, he's coming. Now what do I do? No, she had plenty of planning in front of it. And in our lives, I think it's a good example. Esther's a good example to us. Be prepared for what you're doing. Don't say, oh, I think I'm going to go to college in September. It's August 25th. Maybe I should apply. You don't do it that way, do you? We have to plan, and you strategize what college I'm going to send to, or maybe it's a job interview. You know, how am I going to handle this job interview? What am I going to say when I go in? How am I going to present myself? There's a lot of thought that goes into it, and that's rightly so. Now, does that mean everything depends on us? No. God is also a factor. But, you know, we can't go along and say, well, I'm just not going to plan. I'm going to go by the seat of my pants and just going to think that everything's fine, and maybe it'll come out right, and I'll pray about it. No, you can't do that either. You have to realize that God expects us to do our part, and then he will intervene at the proper time, as we will see today in the story of Esther. So she makes a request and asks that he come to a banquet. Now, this is interesting. She's asking him to come to a banquet. She didn't make the request now. She asked him for another time. And as we come to the banquet, we find out that we're going to find that she asked him actually to a second banquet. And it reminds me, I don't know, have you ever heard of the story of the 1,001 Nights? Anybody heard of that? It's like a story. This king in this story, and he had a wife who committed adultery on him, and he got angry. And so he determined he would never have that again. So as the story goes, he would have a woman come in, and she would be his nightstand, his wife, and then the next morning he'd behead her. That way he'd be sure she's never going to commit adultery on him. And then the next night he'd choose another lady, and she'd become his wife for one night, and then behead her. This happened 1,000 times. And finally this one man's, the visitor's daughter said, I want to go be with the king. And the father tried to talk her out of it. I'm not going to give you the names and all the details, but your father tried to talk her out of it, said, I want to do this. She went into the king, and sometime during the evening, toward the end of the evening, she told him a story. And she had done a lot of reading, was like a poetess, she knew poetry and stories. So she told him this fantastic story. And she stopped in the middle. And he said, well, finish the story. He says, well, I don't have time. It's too late. We got to go to bed. They went to bed. Well, the king couldn't behead her the next day because he wanted to find the end of the story. And so the next day, she came into him again, and she told him the rest of the story. But before the end of the night, she started a second story that was even more intriguing than the first story. And she stopped before she went to bed. And this happened for 1,000 nights, which is basically 3 years. Every night she told him a story, but stopped halfway through, and he was so enamored, he never killed her. She got to the 1,000th night, and she said, I'm all out of stories. I don't have any more stories. And what did the king do? Over the 1,000 nights, he got him to love her so much, he made her his queen. And they continued to live. So I kind of think of, like, as I'm thinking of Esther, it's not like she throws everything into the first night or the first banquet. She's going to make a decision. She says, come to the banquet. So I'm not going to come here and just immediately give you my request. Please come to a banquet with Haman. And now she's thought about what she's going to do as she processes through this. So, and I think that's important. It says in Proverbs 22:11, he who loves purity of heart and whose speech is gracious, the king is his friend. And then in Proverbs 25:15, if you want to write the Proverbs down, if you think they are worth it to you, they're very interesting. It says, by forbearance a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue breaks the bone. When you're dealing with somebody in authority, and that's going to be true for all of us have a boss, right? People look at me and say, oh, you're a major, some of the lower things, you can do anything you want. No, every major's got a lieutenant colonel that he answers to. Every lieutenant colonel has got a colonel that he answers to. And even when we became a colonel, every colonel has got a general that he answers to. And every one of the generals answers all the way up to the president. You always have somebody to answer to. And if you're in school, if you're in work, wherever you are, you have a boss. You have somebody to answer to or somebody you have to deal with. And so the Proverbs that are mentioned here this morning in these two verses are really keys for us. And I'd like to suggest two lessons, and if you have your notes, two lessons we learn from verses 1 through 8 before we move to the second point here. The first one is prayer should precede all important events or decisions. Or prayer should precede any important event or decision. Make sure you bathe it in prayer. Make sure you talk to God about it. Every decision you make is a spiritual decision. You might say, well, I'm just going to go out and, buy some food, and I'm not saying that we have to do it every time, but does God care about what we buy? Yes, If I'm deciding on a school, nothing's too small to talk to God about is my point. When you come to especially important decisions or events, make sure you talk to God first about it. Ask him to help you make a right decision. And then secondly, patience is a virtue and planning a necessity. Patience is a virtue and planning is a necessity. As you look at what you're doing in life, as you look at what you're ministering to in church, as you're working through your job, you have to realize planning is a necessity and patience is a virtue. Sometimes we get too, we're an instant society, aren't we? Instant oatmeal, We want everything instantly, and we don't want to wait for it. Give it to me and give it to me now. But be patient. In this particular case, we're going to find that God had some work to do he wanted to do. And by her patience, she allowed God to do the work that he wanted to do, not only in her life, but in the life of her whole nation and the life of the king. Now, as we look at the second part of this story here, well, I call this the intervention of God, verses 9 through chapter 6, verse 14. And as we look at this section, we'll find that Haman's pride does him in, and he is humiliated. Let's look at this is basically the nemesis of it. Let's start at verse 9. It says, then Haman went out. So Haman goes to this party, with the queen, this banquet, and he's really feeling good. After all, who invited him to the party? The queen. What two people in the kingdom got to go? The king and little old Haman. He says, I'm pretty important. He walks out, it says, and he's very glad and pleased of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand up or tremble before him, because Haman thought he should tremble before me because I'm a real big guy. When that didn't happen, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. We can find two problems with Haman. He's angry and he's proud. That's a bad combination, anger and pride. But it says, verse 10, Haman controlled himself and went to his house and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches. So he spends number of time as you're looking through this section talking about all the good things he has done in life. All the riches he has, his sons, how great they are. He just starts spouting off. He's hoping that talking about all the ways in which he's good will make him feel better about the fact that Mordecai doesn't care about him. And Mordecai doesn't pay any attention to him. Pride is his downfall. In verse 11 it says, then he recounted to him his glory, and he promoted him, and he described how the king promoted him above all the princes and servants of the king. So he was really a top dog in the king's cabinet, you might say. Let's look at a couple other verses in Proverbs. Let me just read these to you. If you like these, you can write these down also. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 5. Everyone who is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Assuredly, he will not be unpunished. And then a couple verses later, Proverbs 16:18, you all know this. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling. And then lastly, in Proverbs 26:12. Do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for him. You would think all of this good stuff would make him forget about Mordecai, right? Look with me, if you will, let's go down to verse 13. Yet all this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. He allowed one bad thing in his life to superimpose everything else. That was the only thing he could concentrate. Do we ever get like that? Do you ever get to the point where one thing's happened or one bad thing in your life and it just nullifies everything? It's easy for me to do that. Like, for instance, as I think back to that example I gave you with my commander way back in the 103rd Engineers. I think about that. Now, and that kind of sometimes supersedes, there's a lot of other good stuff that went along. And that guy's a friend of mine. You know, even to the day we see him, we'll shake each other's hand. And he's forgotten all about that incident, but I think about it. I guess it just kind of, you know, to me, trying to do the best job I can is such a value for me that when I do something that somebody bugs somebody, it kind of reaches that point. And we have to watch it, because if we if we internalize that and keep it too much and dwell on it, it destroys everything else in our life. And and that's when we can't think about anything positive. We just continually think about things that are negative and down. We need to recognize that things like this happen, and if someone doesn't like us or something goes wrong, we need to look at the positive things in life and continue on and either deal with it if we need to talk to the person if we did something wrong, and then move on. Haman could not do that. Every time he saw Mordecai, it just permeated everything he thought. He'd think, oh, how rich I am. Oh, how much a beautiful wife I have. Oh, I have a bunch of sons. And all of a sudden, Mordecai doesn't bow down to me. And it just ruined his life, as we will see. So he talks to his wife and his friends, and in verse 14 it says, his wife and his friends said, why don't you make a gallows and get the king to give you permission to hang Mordecai on these gallows? And these weren't just any gallows. If you look in the scriptures, it says they were 50 cubits high. Anybody know how big a cubit is? Somebody here I'm sure does. Yeah, well, no, I see somebody doing that. That's exactly right. From here to here, it's about 18 inches. It can be anywhere from 16 to, I guess, 21 inches, depending on how big your arm is. So about 18 inches, we say. So these, if they're 50 cubits, that means they're how high? 75 feet high. He wants us to be a total example when he puts Haman on these, or when he puts Mordecai on this gallows. He wants everybody to see it, and he wants it to be a real big deal. And his family is in on it. They're advising him to do this. So we go into chapter 6, and we find he couldn't sleep. And in verse 6, this particular incident relates back to something else that took place. Look all the way back to chapter 1 with me, if you will. And look back to verse 21. Now, this was an incident we talked about when we were in chapter 1, and it didn't make sense. It's only 3 verses. You're probably thinking, why in the world is this in the book? Why, what is the key? And it's kind of like when you're looking at a movie, a mystery movie, you know, and there's something in the beginning part, and it has an effect later on, but you don't know what it's about. Hear what it is. In verses 1 to 21, 21, it says, in those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigtana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officials from those who guarded the door, began to get angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when the plot was investigated and found to be true, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles of the king's presence. Why in the world is that so significant? Well, here we have the king about to go to another banquet with Haman about to do what? Hang Mordecai on gallows that are 75 feet high. So this is one of those instances where this is just going to happen. I mean, I'm not even sure Mordecai was truly, fully aware of what was taking place. And yet you look in verse 6 and it says, during the night, the king could not sleep. So he gave an order to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles that were read before the king. So if you want to go to sleep, bring in the King's Chronicles. It's going to put you to sleep, you know. Not very interesting, okay? He's listening to these, and it was found written that Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor or dignity is being bestowed on Mordecai for this? Then the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done to him. So the king said, who is in the court? Who walks into the court at that time, do you think? Haman. What is Haman walking into the court to do? He wants to ask the king what? To hang Mordecai. Will you let me string Mordecai up on these gallows? So he walks into this, and it says specifically there, he's walking in to ask him to string Mordecai up. And the king's servant said to him, behold, Haman is here. And the king said, bring him in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what is to be done for the man who the king desires to honor? Mordecai is thinking angry. He's angry at Mordecai. He's prideful. He's just recounted how good he is in the kingdom. So when the king says, I want to honor somebody, what does Haman automatically think? It's me. What would I want the king to do to make me look better? And Again, pride is filling his head with the wrong stuff. And sometimes when we get too proud, we get too self-confident, it fills our head with the wrong thing. And we can't see what's in front of us. So Haman walks in, and he says, whom would the king desire more than me? Then Haman said, for the man whom the king desires, let him do these things. Let him bring a royal robe which the king has worn. So, in other words, don't just bring any old robe. Find one that the king's already worn as saying, this is my... So you're wearing something the king actually wore. It's not like just something from the closet. This is a robe that the king has worn. Let him bring a robe that the king has worn, the horse on which the king has also ridden, not just one from the stables, and put on his head a royal crown. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the one who the king desires to honor. So what does the king say? He looks at Haman and says, you're a great prince. You're the best prince I got. And Haman's probably thinking, this is going to be good. Therefore, I want you to do everything you said as the great prince, and take Mordecai and do everything for Mordecai because he saved my life. So here's the guy who is the one who's came in to ask him to hang Mordecai, and instead, what does he wind up doing? Putting a robe on him that the king's worn, put a crown on his head. Can you imagine the humiliation? I mean, can you really imagine this? Put yourself in Haman's place. He wants to hang Mordecai, and now he's taking the guy who doesn't honor him and who he hates and who is angry at, he's putting on the king, and now putting on the horse and walking him around. But that's not bad enough. He's got to walk around yelling to everybody for him to see, here's the man that the king wants to honor. Honor Mordecai. The humiliation of that. It's really extravagant. And as we look at this section, there's a couple of things I'd like to point out. One, have you ever not been able to sleep? How many people have trouble sleeping sometimes? Okay. Last week was mine. I'd wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, travel time difference. I'm at, 9,000 feet, so the air's a little thin, Wake up. What do? Do you recognize that sometimes God might wake you up? I've heard of instances where someone was woken up in the middle of the night, and they just had this prodding, pray for some missionary. And I don't have the exact story, but I've read numerous ones like that. They pray for the missionary, and then the person comes back, and lo and behold, they found out that missionary in a different time zone was going through a crisis at that very moment. I was talking to a pastor, has a few rentals himself up in central Pennsylvania, and he had this one big place that he was renovating as a place. And he went over to Africa, was doing a visit over there. He just told me this story a couple months ago, so that's why it's fresh in my mind. And he was praying, he's having a hard time renovating this thing. It's cost him a lot of money. He's saying, God, maybe I should sell this thing. I'm just not sure how to do this. And he's praying over in Africa, please, Lord, give me your direction as to what you want me to do in this house. The next day, he gets, I think it was the next day, he gets some sort of a word, finally gets in touch with his wife the next day, or she says, please call me, or whatever. He calls her, and guess what he finds out? Huh? Burned to the ground. It was an historic building. The whole thing just burned totally. They tried to figure back to the point, and the fire occurred at the same exact time he was praying over in Africa. God, tell me what I should do. Because he was thinking about selling it back to the city or whatever. Tell me what I should do. And at that moment, the house burned down. And it wasn't just a house, it was an apartment house. Things like this happen. Sometimes when we are prompted, if God prompts you to pray for something or do something, do it. So many times it's happened. I think I've told this story a long time ago. I had a friend of mine who sent me a card at Christmas and said to me, how you doing? And just it was actually played here. I remember Dick Penner played the trumpet for Memorial Day one day. A friend of mine from the military, actually a relative of Bill Pace, and he sent me this card. So I wanted to get back to him, and I don't know if I tried to call him and didn't get through or whatever, but I wanted to really do it. So I had this note sitting on my desk. It was sitting there for like 3 or 4 months, and call him. And I kept on postponing it, but I didn't want to throw away the note because I really wanted to call him and thank him for his card and see how he's doing. One day I got a call from his wife. He had been in a hospital, which I didn't know, for about a month down in Philadelphia. And she called me to let me know that he had died. and she wanted me to say something at his funeral because I was such a special person to him. We really connected in a lot of ways. We both played trumpet. I was a chaplain in the military and so forth. And I just thought, I should have done it when I was prompted to do it. You don't postpone stuff. And that's what happened here. This interruption in the king's night where he couldn't sleep wasn't a fact that he just had heartburn from the dinner the night before. God woke him up. God made specific sure that the part of the Chronicles that happened to be read to the kings was the part about Mordecai. Now, if you were saying coincidence, what's the chance of all the Chronicles, them picking out the one spot where Mordecai was mentioned? Pretty slim. But Esther had asked the people to pray. And even though God's name is not in this book, God answered her prayer. Here's some of the coincidences, not in those two. How about Haman walking in just at the time the king wanted to ask what I should do for someone? Is that a coincidence? How about Haman's recommendation, honor me, and then having to honor Mordecai? All these things, they weren't just coincidences like in the Hardy Boy books. It was actually designed by God. Now, had Esther planned all this? No. She planned for a banquet, didn't she? She asked the king to come to a banquet with Haman. And at that first banquet, she asked for a second banquet the next day. Now, I don't know why she asked for a banquet the second day. I don't know if in the first banquet she said, whether she was saying, I don't know, should we do this or shouldn't we do this, and wasn't sure what she was going to do. And then all of a sudden, just when the king said, I'll give you half the kingdom, Esther, what do you want? And she thought, a banquet, I don't know what to say. I'm not really sure this is ready to pull the trigger and ask this request. I don't know if she said all along, she planned on saying, we're going to do two banquets. Let me get into the first banquet. At the first banquet, I'm going to automatically ask him for the second banquet. I don't know if she got him to the first banquet and chickened out. Maybe she got it's time to ask him, I can't do that right now. You ever chickened out of doing something? Maybe it's God's way of having, I don't know, but she had no idea of what was going to take place that night. And whether she chickened out, whether she planned the second meeting, or what took place, God intended to do something miraculous that night because he was going to wake up the king and he was going to humiliate Haman so that Haman would be off his game. Two lessons for you. Write these down. This is important. If you have those notes, pull out this thing because this is so important. Anger and pride are a perfect recipe for disaster. Anger and pride are a perfect recipe for disaster. Will you get a little proud? Will you get mad at somebody? People come to me in the military or or in the church, they'll say, I'm angry. What do I do when I get angry? If I'm angry at my kids, what do I do? Don't discipline them right away. Count to 10, I always tell them. Somebody recently told me 10, that's a long time. Well, you may need 10 to get there, You get angry or mad at somebody. Before you say something, count to 10. This pastor's boot camp is what it was that I was at this last week. One of the phrases I remember, it said, hurting people hurt people. Hurting people hurt people. And if we're hurting, we're angry, we're discouraged, or something's going wrong in our life, take 10. Count to 10 before you say something that you can't retract. Because once it's said, it's never coming back. And that person's probably going to remember it for a long, long time. Count to 10. Second thing, God intervenes in our plans for his outcome. God intervenes in our plans for his outcome. We should plan. And I will tell you, just a quick picture. We're getting down to the end here, and I really need to move on to this third passage real fast. But, I got really off my game when Jonathan had his accident. It was interesting because that June, I just started my doctoral work. That was 10 years ago. Just started my doctoral work. And part of that was doing a life cycle projection to see what God's done in your lives. I carry around with me in black and white. Here it is. I have the whole thing. I went back to when I was born, all the way through, and everything that God had done in his life. And I was so sure that my plans were there. This was written, was that 10 years ago? I had the next 3 years planned out on this. What unit I was going to be at, how things were going to work out. And before this thing was completed, I was out of the National Guard and over the reserves. Jonathan was in the hospital, and my whole plan went right down the toilet. And so I get a little nervous about saying make plans these days, to be honest with you, because I realize that plans can change in an instant. Things we thought we had all set up just don't work out. But it doesn't mean we can't plan. It means we need to plan, but we need to remember this particular lesson. God intervenes in our plans for his outcome. I probably would have never gotten the second deployment. I would have never got a colonel. There are so many things in Jonathan's life, some of the stuff that's going on in his life. Our plans changed. But it doesn't mean don't plan. It means plan and realize God can intervene. Thirdly, this last section, chapter 7, is only 10 verses long. Let's take a brief look at it. They come to the second banquet. And let me change my paper over here so I get the channel to chapter 10 here as we look at it. And I call this the demise of enemies, the second banquet at Haman's end. This is so interesting as we look through this passage. Verses 1 through 5, now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. Why'd they come? To drink wine. Wine is mentioned 7 times in this book, and it's mentioned 3 times in this particular chapter. And I think that the wine that the king is imbibing, has somewhat of an impact on some of the stuff that's taking place, and Haman also. They are drinking. Let me tell you, by the time we get to the end of this banquet, they are inebriated. Okay, they're maybe not drunk and falling down, but their minds are full of wine, and it's affecting their judgment. And so it comes up here in verse 1, and it says, the king said to Esther, on the second day also, this is the 3rd time, what do you want? Up to half of the kingdom. And Esther said, I pray that you'll give me my life. Let me just read these words so you get exactly. O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given to me as my petition and my people as my request. For we've been sold, and my people to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now, if he had only been slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent. And I wouldn't trouble you for such a little thing, commensurate with the annoyance to the king. But it's my very life that's about to be lost. Someone is trying to kill me. She is not shown that she is Jewish here. She just said, someone's trying to kill me and all of my people. And the king, of course, is pretty annoyed, and he says, who is trying to kill you? And it's verse 5. Then the king of Ahasuerus says, who is he and where is he? Who would presume to do such a thing, to kill my queen? And Esther said, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. Sitting right there. These guys are a little bit inebriated, and Haman's thinking real good. He has no idea what's coming up. I don't even know if when she said, someone's trying to kill me, he even connected the two. She never said she was a Jew. He's probably thinking, who in the world would want to kill the queen? That's a pretty stupid thing to do. He has no idea until she points to him. It's this wicked Haman. And all of a sudden, the wheels come off the train. In Proverbs 31, 4 and 5, it says, it is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to desire strong drink. For they will drink and forget what is decreed, and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. If you're in a place of importance, alcohol can sometimes help you make wrong decisions. And that's not just for kings, it's for all of us. Now, I'm not telling you can't drink, okay? Some say you can drink in moderation. But you're playing with fire. And especially if you're in a place where you need to make important decisions. Like driving. You say, well, I'm not drunk driving. I'm not over the legal limit. I'll tell you what. If you're driving down the road and a little kid walks in front of you and it takes you 1/100th of a second longer to put on the brakes and you kill the child, it doesn't matter whether you were legally drunk or not. You delayed a reaction, a decision by a brief moment. And so the king, I think as we're looking at this, we see what's happening. Haman's probably inebriated. He thinks, I'm everything good. All of a sudden, you're done. The king walks out to the garden, as you'll talk the story. He walks out. He can't handle it. He's got to walk out and think for a few seconds. He walks out of the room. What's Haman do? Haman says, boy, I better plead for my life. I'm about to lose it. He sees the writing on the wall. So Esther is reclining on the bench, as they do when they're eating there. And he jumps down and he, Esther, please, clean Esther. Give me my life back. As he's doing this, The king walks back in from the garden, and what's he see? Haman all over Esther, trying to convince her to please save his life. He said, "You're going to assault the queen in my very presence when I'm still in the house?" And it says they put a hood over him, they covered his face, and took him out. And then one of the guys, the eunuchs that's taking care of Esther, who we find in chapter 1, if you look back, he said, "I don't know what to do with this guy." Hey, and this eunuch says, "King, I don't know if you noticed, but you see those big gallows over there?" He said, Haman was intending to hang Mordecai on those. And the king says, "Good, hang Haman on his own gallows." They take him out and they hang him on the 75-foot gallows. And thus ends the story. A couple of lessons in this particular last part. And again, alcohol is not the only topic we ever talk about, and I don't talk about it very much, but you got to be wise. And let me give you this first one. Alcohol can inhibit good judgment and amplify bad choices. Just keep that in mind. If you decide, I want to drink, or I can drink, or I'm going out, just keep in mind, alcohol can inhibit good judgment and amplify bad choices. Secondly, be prepared to give a wise response to available opportunities. Be prepared to give a wise response to available opportunities. Esther was asked, "What do you want me to do?" And she had thought about this for now probably 5 days, 3 days of fasting, 2 banquets. She was ready now. And she was ready with exactly what she wanted to say. And she delivered it with perfection because she had been ready. Always be ready to give a wise response when someone asks. And if you're a little bit angry, a little bit proud, if someone asks a question, there's no embarrassment of counting to 10 first and thinking a little bit. And then saying, "This is my response." Our theme this morning is this, the overarching thing of all of these. Patience and wisdom overcomes anger and pride for God's glory. 4 characteristics. Patience and wisdom overcomes anger and pride for God's glory. We all need a little bit of this, don't we? We need to think before we talk. We need to plan, but trust God for wisdom. We need to recognize that God can intervene in our lives at exactly the right moment for the exactly right purposes. Because Romans 8:28 and 28 says, "For God causes all things to work together for good to those who are called according to his purpose." Dear Lord, we thank you for your love for us. Help us this week to go out from Esther and recognize the wisdom, the planning on all the different parts of her life, and that it might give us confidence as we go through life to make right choices and to represent you. We thank you that you intervened in this case. Even though Israel was sinning and they were in Babylon because of discipline, yet you intervened in their lives to save the nation. May you intervene in our lives in unexpected ways to do your will. In Jesus' name, amen.